Welcome to the Gippsland Art Gallery. My name is Gregg and I'm the director of the gallery, and this is the second of my little tours through the gallery today. I'm going to take you through stories from the collection, which is an exhibition of around 100 artworks from the gallery's permanent collection. I would just remind you that this is a 360-degree tour, so you don't necessarily have to look at me, you don't even have to look at the picture I'm talking to. You can navigate through anywhere you want in the space using your touchscreen or using your mouse. So wonderful new technology, and this is the first time I've done it, so I hope you enjoy the tour. I'm going to start this little tour through the exhibition with a fairly major acquisition that we made last year. It's Fred Williams's work, Rockface at Agnes Falls. This was part of an exhibition of Gippsland landscapes by Fred that we showed late last year and was generously donated to the gallery by the Williams family subsequent to that. So Fred Williams, I guess one of the iconic artists of 20th century Australian art, spent about 6-7 years living in London in the 1950s, and when he came back to Australia in 1957, he basically reinvented the Australian landscape as we knew it. He drew on a lot of the formal elements of European modernism that he'd seen in Europe, Cubism, particularly Paul Cézanne. He saw a lot of Cézanne's, and when he returned to Australia, he applied those lessons that he'd learnt in Europe to the Australian landscape. So in Rockface at Agnes Falls, completed in 1979, it was one of a series of waterfalls that Fred painted. He painted, I think, 11 waterfalls between 1978 and 1979, inspired by seeing Eugene von Guerard's painting the Strath Creek waterfall at the Art Gallery in New South Wales. So he'd reached a point in his career where he was looking for new challenges, something to test him with. By this point, he'd already had a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He'd been collected by all the major galleries and most of the regional galleries in Australia. He was actually on the board of the National Gallery of Australia as well. So he'd gone about as far as he could go as an artist in Australia. So he was looking to take that next step. Now, interestingly, Fred never drove in his life. He passed away in 1982, so he did rely on artist friends and family to drive him around. He made a number of visits to Gippsland throughout his lifetime. Starting in the late 50s, he went to Wilson's Prom, and then he did a major series in 1968 based at Wilson's Prom. He continued to paint the coastlines around Wonthaggi and Walkerville and Venus Bay, but in 1979 we find him painting the Agnes Falls in South Gippsland. So obviously not a literal depiction of the waterfalls, there's a kind of abstract quality going on. You see Fred's typical use of all these different colours, the mauve, the pinks, the purples, the yellows, the greens. There's so much colour in there, and yet he manages to make it coherent and to create an image that is very reminiscent of Agnes Falls. If you've been there, you'll probably almost recognise it. But at the same time, it's a painting that draws on the abstract elements of two-dimensional painting. So it's first and foremost, it's a piece of canvas covered with paint, and Fred never stopped acknowledging that within his work. So I'm going to keep moving now. There's a lot to look at. The exhibition here is approximately chronological, but we did play around with a few little pieces just to make it more interesting. We're looking now at the late 19th century period, Charles Rolando's Woodcutters clearing, which we acquired for the gallery collection several years ago now. One of the major 19th century works from the gallery collection. Almost everything here is from or about the Gippsland region, and the natural environment is a recurring theme within the collection. We're getting to the mid to late 19th century here. We're looking at some lithographs by Nicolas Chevalier and Eugene von Guerard, all again depicting the Gippsland region. One of my favourites in the collection is Chevalier's lithograph of the McAllister Valley. Here we see Chevalier climbing up a rock face. He's just ascended the top, and he's with the German scientist George von Neumayer, who Chevalier accompanied on a scientific expedition through Gippsland in 1862. And there was Chevalier's dog Hector, who unfortunately didn't make it to the end of their journey in that instance. Another sort of key work from the collection is Refuge, Cove, Wilson's Promontory. And I've done a little bit of research into this one. When I started at the gallery 11 years ago, we didn't know who made it. My best bet now is Albert Charles Cook, who we know did visit Wilson's Promontory, and in about 1872. This work was published as an engraving in Melbourne, one of the periodicals by Samuel Colvert, based on this watercolour. And I'm pretty confident it is by Cook, but if you've got any other ideas of who may be the artist, we'd love to hear them. One of the real characters of the collection is William Dexter, who did these two little pen and ink drawings from the late 1850s. Dexter was living here about 1857 to 1858. He was only here for a year or two, living initially at Stratford, neighbours of Angus Macmillan, and there's a whole story there I won't go into today, but he eventually moved into Sale and ran for the Victorian Legislative Assembly. And he was a real, quite well known within the region, but he only managed to get 9 votes. He was probably best known as an artist. He developed his work in England. He was born in Melbourne, in England, not Melbourne, Australia. And I could talk forever about William Dexter, but just having a really quick look at this today. So these are views of the goldfields in Gippsland. Jennifer Mallet's stunning work, Bruth and Dreaming. It's a more recent work. We tend to see this as kind of the starting point for the collection because this is imagining a time before humans were here. It's part of the Gunno Curno dream time. Jennifer, obviously very, very talented local artist. Moving through, we've got Percy Masters' work of Walhalla, Charles McCubbin's Sail in the Year of the Tree, one of the real icon pieces of the collection. A number of pieces from the newly formed Gippsland Textile Collection, which is still growing thanks to the generosity of some local benefactors who've enabled us to acquire textile works celebrating the region. Moving through, we're looking at the 1950s, 1960s here, a few other key works. Shay Docking's Through the Bush in the centre here. Shay was someone who drew heavily upon the natural environment, studied the natural environment, was very interested in geology and rocks, ancient rock formations in particular. We can see a lot of that influence within her work. Albert Tucker's work, Brolga in the Bush, which came to us recently from the Esso collection of Australian art. Tucker had been living overseas in England, in France, and he spent time in New York. When he returned to Australia, a little bit like Fred Williams at that similar time, this is about 1960, he reinvented the Australian landscape and he started to paint it in a different way that we were used to seeing. And he had did a whole series of birds in the early 1960s, spent a bit of time in Gippsland then. This is a little bit of a display of some of the ceramics that have recently come into the collection. We currently have about 250 really stunning ceramic pieces in the gallery collection, and we're rotating pieces through all the time, so you get to see some of that. Winding up the tour now, we've got William Freitas' piece above, Landscape, which is one of the very first works acquired by the gallery, donated by William Freitas. When he heard that the gallery was going to open in 1965. He was at that time the president of the Victorian Artists Society and very generously offered a piece to the gallery. And below that is Godfrey Miller's Untitled work, a very late work for him. He was a very detailed cubist artist, active 1940s and 50s. This is about 1963, 64, within his sort of last year of life when he's just kind of letting go, and this is about as airy as his works became. So moving through again, just quickly, more works from the Esso collection of Australian art, focusing on the 1940s, 50s and 60s, lots of natural environment views, lovely view looking down the Thompson River here in Sale as well, and then some early 20th century works interspersed with some more contemporary pieces as well. So I'm going to leave it there. Once again, I do hope you're able to come back and enjoy the exhibition in the flesh once we do reopen. We don't know when that will be just yet, obviously, but we look forward to seeing you all back at the gallery again soon.